Welcome to Automation Fight Night.
But before we start, should we start telling people what the first rule of Fight Night is? You do not talk about Fight Night? No, shit, that was Fight Club. Do we actually have any rules?
Different.
Do we have any rules or?
I think just enjoy the session.
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah, that's a good one. By the way, come to think of it, why did we actually call it Fight Night? What if people are watching this in the morning or in the afternoon? It doesn't make any sense.
No, then it's just Fight Morning for you.
Welcome to Fight Morning, Fight Afternoon, or Fight Night.
It doesn't sound that catchy.
Yeah.
So
let's just start. Anyway, welcome to our session here at Converge on the difference between scripting language and programming languages. This is actually the sequel to our previous Converge session that we did last year called Clash of the Titans, which was between PowerShell and Python. So before we start, let's just allow us to introduce ourselves first. So, my name is Eltjo from Gulik, and I have a confession to make. I don't know anything about C# and Go.
Thank you for spoiling the languages, Eltjo.
Yeah, so sorry.
Was already in the description, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah. So
what do you do in your...
I'm the principal consultant for RawWorks. I do know some scripting languages. I'm a very avid Python programmer, but that's about it. And
you can actually see it in the beard.
You can see it in the beard, yeah, for sure. Yeah. I'm joined here by my esteemed colleague and partner in crime, Ververs-Bijkerk. And you do know some programming languages, don't you?
That's me. Yeah, I know a little bit. I do have also a confession to make that I'm not a programmer, but I can write some C# and recently also dived into some Go. So if you have any comments about the languages or the examples that we show, feel free to provide the comments, but you can also contribute as everything is going to be on GitHub. So I also work at RawWorks and I'm a technical evangelist, so working with customers, helping into the new world of deploying their environments in a DevOps manner. And active in the community, just like Eltjo. So if you have any questions, you can always reach out. Our contact details is on the slide. So, but before we're going to all the details, let's talk a little bit about history. And what I understand, it all starts with the typewriter.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you there, Ryan, but actually one of the first forms of automation wasn't a typewriter, it was the printing press, which was invented in Germany around 1440 by a guy called Johannes Gutenberg. And that invention meant that after the invention, they could print more than 3,000 pages a day instead of the 40 by using hand printing. Talk about automation.
And that in
1440. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, that's way before the typewriter then.
For sure. Yeah.
Interesting.
You have some interesting facts about the typewriter then, Ryan?
No, that you can just type on it, and I thought it was a form of automation, but apparently I'm wrong. So, let's go to the more interesting details. Let's talk about Python.
Oh, actually, before we get to Python, come to think of it, do you know what the first programming language was, Ryan?
I have no clue.
Well, the first programming language was called the Algorithm for the Analytical Engine, and it was invented by a lovely lady called Ada Lovelace way back in 1883. So only a couple of years after the invention of the typewriter. And its purpose was to help Babbage and Bernoulli with number computations.
That's impressive. Can you actually write in that one language?
I have no idea. No, probably not. No. So back to Python. Python was invented by a fellow Dutchman, Guido van Rossum. And on the contrary to what's listed here, it was actually invented in 1998 instead of 1991, Ryan. What the hell?
Yeah, but did you know that the 1991 is the official release date of Python?
I did not. Thank you very much.
So therefore the release date. Yeah.
So next up we have
C#.
C#. So C#, according to Wikipedia, is a general purpose multi-paradigm programming language, and it's an evolution on the C and C++ languages. So Wikipedia also mentions that C# encompasses static typing, strong typing, lexically scoped, imperative, declarative, functional, generic, and object-oriented, class-based, and component-oriented programming disciplines.
Wow. Okay.
And I have no idea what I just read.
It's a language, yeah.
It's a language, yeah. What I do know is that the name C# was inspired by the musical notation, whereby a sharp symbol indicates that the note should be played in a higher pitch. And it's actually pretty similar to the language name of C++, where the double plus sign indicates that the variables should be incremented by 1. And it also means that the representation of the sharp symbol represents 4 pluses instead of 2.
Wow. Okay. I think those are very, very valuable details. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know
right?
that.
So moving on, PowerShell and Go are actually relatively new languages. For Go is probably the oldest board game in the world and originated some 4,000 years ago in China. Oh crap! I think I read
that's a different one.
Yeah, I read the wrong Wikipedia entry.
Go, yeah.
So Go was actually designed in 2007 by Google to improve programming productivity. And as we see here, the first release was most probably in 2009.
Yep, that's correct. And finally, we're not going to cover everything from .NET Core, but it's important at least to highlight that with the move from Microsoft towards a more wider landscape, .NET Core was introduced in 2016 to also support Linux-based operating systems. So.
Yeah, that's also the case for PowerShell, right? Based on the .NET Core framework.
Yeah, that's correct. So you can leverage PowerShell also on Linux-based operating systems, which is very, very powerful. Yeah,
and useful. Yeah, for sure.
So let's first go to the developer survey, and this is from Stack Overflow, and it's actually a very nice source to get all the nifty details of what's happening in the developer world, and especially also the languages. So we highlighted the languages which is mostly used in the developer community that's leveraging Stack Overflow, and I know everybody uses Stack Overflow to copy paste the code. I also do it, so. Just
Ryan,
admit it.
Do you want to mention here our top contender? Third place, most used languages.
JavaScript, but we're not going to cover that. Yeah, I have to admit, okay, Python, but it's because of the age, man.
Yeah, for sure. Python is widely used and has been widely used for a long time now. And as you can see, by the way, that even though Go is only used by 10% of the respondents for Stack Overflow, it is getting a lot of traction nowadays.
Yeah, I know that there are a couple sessions also on Converge talking about Terraform. And HashiCorp is actually leveraging Go a lot for all their development. So I know that all the Terraform providers are all written in Go. So it's becoming more and more popular. And I think it's also for PowerShell, so it's now supported also on Linux-based operating systems. So I see the potential to being more leveraged in the future.
Yep.
But let's go to the details instead of the history and all the information. And let's go to the real examples.
Yeah, so let's first dive into... we're not going to dive into some examples yet. Do you want to talk about the setup, please, Ryan?
Yeah, so we're going to cover the 4 languages. So Python, PowerShell, C# and Go. And this is going to be the setup for the entire presentation. So we're going to show you side-by-side comparisons. Now, as the details are going bigger and bigger, we'll eventually show in small sections, but you will see it. So, but let's first start with some basics.
Yeah, so for the basics, in the top 2 rows, we have Python and we have PowerShell. And we'll start by declaring some variables. And as you can see, the declarative system for variables in both Python and Go are relatively simple. There's no command for declaring variables. You just define the variable name and you specify its base value. So in both languages, variables don't need to be declared with a particular type. So if you declare a variable and put an integer value in it, it is an integer. If you put a string in it, it's going to be a string. So back to
it's actually for all the languages, by the way.
Nowadays. Exactly.
Yeah.
So what we have here, first we declare a variable and we assign it a integer value. We can use print in Python to put out the actual value, and we can write -host in PowerShell. Increment operations are very simple. In this case, you can use the plus and equal sign to increment a integer variable. For string values, they can just be declared just like integer values. You have to encompass the string in double or single quotes. Both are available and both are okay.
But do you know the difference, what the behavior is of a double quote and a single quote?
That's a very good question. No, I don't.
Actually, I'm not sure how it's in Python, because I'm not a Python man, thanks to the beard. But I know that in PowerShell, when you use a single quote, it's a hard string. When you're using double quote and you embed a variable in the string, it will be translated. With a single quote, it will not be translated.
Okay.
It's an important one to know.
Very good, very good. I didn't know that. I learned something today. So both Python and PowerShell have built-in methods to convert the strings. For example, we use here the upper method and toUpper in PowerShell to convert the string to uppercase. var3 is a Boolean, a declaration for a Boolean variable. And for both scripting languages, we can use the built-in variable types true. Mind you, in Python, it is mandatory to use a capital T. One big difference to note between PowerShell and Python is that in PowerShell, the variables needs to be preceded by a $sign in order to become a variable.
Correct.
Yeah. Ryan, you want to tell something about the variables declarations in C# and Go, please?
Yeah, no problem. So the first thing you're gonna see is that there's a lot of more text involved in both C# and Go, and this also had to do with it's a compiled language. So there's more requirements in order to get it running. And in the C# example, it's a console application for this particular example. Basically, the definition of the variables is quite similar. For C#, it's the console write line. And for Go, it's the format and a print line, which is a package that needs to be imported, as you can also see on the right bottom corner. And basically, it's the same as the other languages. The only big difference is you have to declare a variable by using var and then the variable name, but the value will be translated based on your input. It can be, you can declare also the variables using the type itself. That's possible. I use always the var because it will translate towards what it is. So what we're gonna show today is we want to show two ways for interacting with the Citrix Cloud API. And the first one, which is interesting, is the resource locations, which is the location definitions in Citrix Cloud. And we took this one because it's a particular get. You're getting information out of the portal. The second one is sending a notification towards the portal. So that means that we're gonna post information towards the Citrix Cloud portal. But before we can do that, we do require authentication. So let's start with the authentication part. Otherwise, it won't work, right?
Yeah, for sure. Before you can get started to use any of the Citrix APIs, and it doesn't matter which one, you first need to create an API client. And Citrix actually did a really good job in documenting this. The link is shown here in the bottom. They also got some examples there, which will show you as well. So after you create the API client, you will get a client ID and a client secret, and those are used for the initial authentication to the cloud APIs.
So just follow the instruction, and it's very well documented. Now, to leverage at least the ID and the secrets, It's recommended to store something in, you can use a system variable. This is also the examples that Pat Patterson is using a lot. But we do recommend at least to use a key vault if you're using production code instead of the environment variables.
Yeah, and it can be a local key vault or something like an Azure key vault to store your secrets.
For example. Yeah. So I got one pro tip because it took me a lot of time. When defining the variables, make sure to restart your entire IDE. So in this case, Visual Studio Code, instead of just the PowerShell instance in Visual Studio Code, as otherwise the variables won't be picked up.
Yeah, I actually got another pro tip for you as well, Ryan.
Oh?
Yeah. Please recycle the client ID and client secret after the presentation.
You can try to copy it. I already done it. So.
Awesome.
It's just an example.
Yeah, true. Let's dive into some coding examples then. As stated before, first thing we need to do is to set up the authentication. And for authentication, Citrix lies on OAuth 2. So that's what we're going to leverage. The first thing we need to do is to set up the URL that we're going to use. And that's specified in the URI variable, both for PowerShell as for Python. For Python, before we start, we have to import two modules. We have to import the request module that we're going to use to make the actual request, and we have to import the OS module. Not necessary for PowerShell, but it is necessary for Python. So after we define the URL that we're going to call to get the bearer token, we need to define the body. And in the body, we provide both the client ID and client secret that we created in the last example. And we provide the grant type. In this case, the grant type is the client credentials. So both languages, we put that into the body, and we can do the actual request. So for Python, we use requests.post, and for PowerShell, we can use the invoke REST method. In both cases, we specify the URL and the body, and we use a try-catch loop for the error handling, just as best practices define. We got an object back, and in both cases, we have that in the token object, and that's also something that we can print out, and we use that one later to do actual authentication. So as you can see, we only used 15 lines of code for the authentication in both Python and PowerShell.
PowerShell is even a little bit less.
PowerShell is even a little bit less, yeah, because we have the imports and you put a comment in for PowerShell, so you cheated.
That's that's correct. Now, for a programming language, you can already see here that it's way more to get this going into a programming language. So the first thing that's the main difference is that you have an object definition in both languages. In C#, it's a class. In Go, it's a struct. And this is required when we get a response. We need to translate towards an object so we can leverage that object. So this is required. There are probably ways to do it without, but this is one of the best practices at least to include. Now, as you can see here, both getting the tokens are defined in a separate method for C# and a function for Go, as this is also one of the best practices. It's important to note that we can also do this in Python and in PowerShell. We will also do that in a future stage, but this is as a programming language, we did it right away. It's the same build-up, so we are collecting the environment variables as shown in the previous steps, defining the URL for both languages, and creating the parameters in C# and a body object in Go. Eventually, we are defining a new token object because we want to translate what we get back from the API towards the object. And then we just call it. And eventually the result is exactly the same. You will get your token object and rewrite write the access token towards the output. Now there's a thing that you need to know. It's the async. When you're calling an API, it's most likely using async calls. That means that you can do more steps parallel. It's asynchronous. So therefore, we're also specifying a wait because we need the token first before we can continue towards the next steps. So that's it.
Cool. So with that out of the way, we can actually get into our first proper example, the resource locations. So again, just like in the authentication example, we'll start with the scripting languages in Python and in PowerShell. And just like Ryan explained, we did place the authentication steps here in a separate function this time. We did that by using the def keyword for Python and the function keyword for PowerShell. For PowerShell, we placed the function at the back of at the end of the script. In Python, it's mandatory to put it before you use the function in the rest of your code. So both functions basically do the same thing. They get the token and return the token as an object back. In this case, once we have the token for our authentication, we can call the URL to get the resource locations. In this case, it's registry.citrix workspace-api.net, your customer ID, and then the resource locations. In both cases, we need to set up a header this time, and in the header we specify that the authentication is done by using a bearer token, and we pass it the token that we got back from our getToken function. So after we set up the header, again, we can use a try-catch loop or a try-except loop to do the actual requests. It's a getter this time because we want to get the resource locations. In case of Python, we use request.get, and in case for PowerShell, we used invoke REST method with the. Why do we use the post method instead of the get method?
You're looking at the function of the getToken. You need to look up. It's
oh my
god! Yeah,
gosh, yeah. I'm getting old in here. Yeah. Okay. So
it's also the getter. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's also a getter of course. Very sorry for that. I
made a similar mistake while practicing this. Yeah.
So, to reiterate, in both cases we use a get method. For PowerShell, it's the invoke REST method with the get keyword. We specify the headers as well. And what we get back is an object which we can reiterate through the locations, and it'll show us all the resource locations available to us in both examples. So this is, as you can see, a little bit more code than we had in the authentication steps. There are around 40 lines of code here. Keep that in mind while you look at Ryan and the programming languages code.
Yeah, so there we go.
My word, Ryan, this isn't even readable for the folks. Come on.
Let's get your magnifying glass out and let's go to the... No, it's not doable. As you can see, at least in the scripting language, an object is received and you can just directly manipulate the object itself. But again, like the token, we need to define at least the objects here in the programming language. And in this case, we define it in an items collection and items. Now, in C# you cannot define a class with the property that has the same name. So therefore, it's a different name. And the location. And you can see here that it contains all the various information. It's an ID, a name, and the internal only, for example.
So these are the object responses that you're going to get back, right? And you need to predefine those. So I have a question now, Ryan. How do you know what the object responses will be before you do an actual request?
That's a great question.
Thank you very much.
Luckily, Citrix has documented that, so you can just go to the Citrix API documentation, and you can at least see what you can expect from the response. Another pro tip is just use PowerShell, for example. You can also just see what object it is. It's very easy to call the APIs using PowerShell.
Yeah, instead of PowerShell, you could also use Python, by the way, but that's my personal preference.
No, go away with Python.
Okay, back to the code, Ryan.
Yeah, so again, it's way similar. So we're leveraging the getToken function, which we already shown in the method, I have to say, shown in the previous example. We're building it up same way as we do in the scripting language. We're setting the authentication header. And in this case, for C#, and we are defining the items collection. And then in a try-catch, we're getting the response and translating that towards the object. That's the JSON convert, because we're getting JSON back. We need to deserialize it towards an object, and then we can leverage that object. And at the bottom, you see we're iterating towards the various locations in the locations items.
Yeah, just like we did in PowerShell and Python with a for each loop.
Yeah, so for Go, it's similar. We're also declaring a variable which is based on the items. And in this case, we're using the JSON unmarshal to translate the response, which is in this case already in bytes, towards an object. And then we can also iterate through this. So let's go to the final example, which is sending the notification.
Yeah, and in this example, we sent a notification to the Citrix Cloud Portal to all of the admins. And again, we'll start with Python and PowerShell, because the codes are getting longer and longer. Let's break it down in a couple of steps. Yeah, there we are. Okay, so first off, just in all the examples, we need to do our authentication. So we request a new token with the get token functions that we defined. We set up the URL. In this case, it's notifications.workspace API.net, preceded by our environment/notifications/items. So again, in this case, we need to set up the body, but the body is a little bit more complicated in this case because we have much more things to specify. First off, we can specify the destination admin. In this case, we use the asterisk to denote that we're going to send a message to all available administrators. We have the component. I have no idea what that does, but according to Citrix, we need to supply that. And next up, we got the create date. And the create date is a little bit different because we have to put that in an exact format in UTC time. And you had a remark on that.
So as you can see, on the PowerShell end, we don't specify the format. We're just getting the date and put it in a universal time, and PowerShell will translate that correctly in towards the JSON object. Well, for Python, we need to specify the exact same string.
Yep. Otherwise, you'll get an error message. We tried that by trial and error. Next up is the event ID, and the event ID is a randomly generated UID number. So for Python, we use UUID and UUID4. With PowerShell, we can just use the new GUID.GUID method to generate one. Content is also interesting because a notification can have multiple content notifications. So we have an embedded in the body as the content again. Next up, we need to set up the header. This is where Python and PowerShell differ a bit because in Python, we need to specify the content type as applications.json in the header, whereas with PowerShell, we can just specify that as a parameter of invoke web request. So once we got the header set up, again, we can do the request. In this case, it is a post. Encompassed again in a try except loop to catch any errors that might be being thrown our way. And in this case, in PowerShell, we didn't use an invoked REST method, but we used the invoke web request. And we did that because we also wanted to collect the status code or the return code of the request to check if we actually successfully send a message. In this case, we can use invoke web request because its invoke web request will return a response code. In this case, we are looking for a response code of 200, which denotes success.
Cool. So let's go to the program language, and again, it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So
yeah.
It's similar to the same as previous examples. We need to define the in this case the objects. There's a quick note here that we didn't specify any JSON actions because we're gonna send information, not receiving, which we don't have translated from a JSON object. So therefore, there's no JSON definitions in these classes. Then we'll the structs. Now going into the logic itself. It's very similar towards the other languages. So we're building up the URL that we're gonna leverage, then specifying a body which is based on the struct and the class object of the notification. Exact same build up as Eltjo already explained, and then we're gonna add a notification content to it with the message itself. As you can see here, building up the authentication header, just like the previous time, setting also the content type for both cases, and posting it towards the API. And you can also see in both examples that it's converted towards a JSON object. So the body object is translated to JSON, so it can be accepted by the API itself.
Yeah, a difference I see here is that in C# you also have to set the text encoding to UTF-8, while in Go that is implicitly implied.
Yeah, that's correct. Otherwise, it didn't work. So yeah, that's required. And at the end, we're gonna write the response of the code, so which should be a 200. Now going to the results, at the end you will see that you're receiving a notification in the portal, and you can see all different languages that we sent the notification. So the code that we've shown in the example works. This is not manipulated. You have to trust us. It works.
Oh, you don't have to trust, because as you said, we posted all of the scripts that we use for all languages on GitHub, and we'll probably provide a link to the repository at the end of the presentation.
Yep. So talking about leveraging APIs. Yeah,
so a lot of websites use APIs in the background, but not all websites have an API definition publicly available. And luckily, Ryan has a very good tip for that. Another pro tip.
Yeah, so when you are in your web browser, you can open the developer tools, which all major browsers have. And there you can see all the different calls that it's making, and you can also see the output. So in this case, we collected the statuses, and this is a direct open API you can leverage from Citrix Cloud.
Yeah, in this case, no authentication is necessary.
Correct. And you can directly go to that URL, and you will receive all the information. And using a plugin in your browser, you can also translate the JSON object to a readable format. So it's a handy tool to explore various APIs, so you can create your own logic around it. But looking at the time, we actually are over.
It's already 6:08.
It's beer time. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's very quickly jump to the best practices.
Yeah, so it's always recommended to, when doing stuff in code, use Git versioning to make steps in or version your changes. So you can always step back when you basically fail.
Yeah, so next up are coding standards. Personally, I have very high coding standards. I only use a mechanical keyboard, for instance.
Yeah. And your beard.
And my beard, yeah. But that was not exactly what you meant, I guess, Ryan.
No, when collaborating with others, you need to make sure that you write a little bit in the same style. Everybody has their own coding style and coding standards. But when working in a team, you need to make sure you have a coding standards that everybody works the same and using the same definitions. So it's important to at least collaborate on that. Now, fun fact, comments. It's a little bit of a mix. I'm not a huge fan of comments because if you write your code readable, everybody can read the code and understand what logic, but in some cases it might be useful to add additional comments to it.
Yeah, we did that, for instance, in the PowerShell code to remind us that you have to install some modules before you can use them with the import command, the request module, for instance.
So, and finally, make sure you have proper error handling. When stuff breaks or when the API is not responding, maybe caused by an outage, you need to make sure you handle that error with the logic. Now, there was a lot of information, a lot of examples. So the following QR code can be used to go to the repository where we store all the examples and just have a go. There
was another Go word pun. I knew we had to get 2 in at least.
But if you have any suggestions on to improve it, feel free to comment on it and maybe make a pull request.
Or fork.
You need to make a fork in fork to pull
right.
it. Never mind, we're not going into that details.
Anyway, thank you very much for your time. We hope we inspired you to start using automation with the language of your choice. While each language is different, we've seen that there are a lot of similarities between all the languages shown. And basically, it all boils down to your personal preference. That leaves us with only one thing to say. Thank you very much, and happy coding.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.